There was a time when Star Wars knew exactly what it was doing and why it existed. Not as a brand or a content pipeline, but as a modern myth with a clear spine, a story about moral choice, spiritual consequence, and the cost of power, where fantasy served meaning rather than distracting from it. Classic Star Wars was never vague about its centre. It was mythic without being abstract, simple without being shallow, and every narrative decision bent toward the same gravitational core: how individuals confront fear, temptation, responsibility, and loss, and how those confrontations reshape both the self and the world. Modern Star Wars, by contrast, often feels uncertain of its own thesis, juggling themes of legacy, trauma, identity, politics, nostalgia, and spectacle, without committing long enough for any of them to land with lasting force, resulting in stories that gesture at depth, but rarely excavate it. This uncertainty manifests not as emptiness, but as noise, because when a story does not know what it is ultimately about, it compensates by doing more, referencing more, showing more, until motion replaces direction, and momentum is mistaken for meaning. Lore becomes the substitute for narrative clarity, with continuity, Easter eggs, and canon alignment elevated to primary concerns, as if recognition itself were a form of storytelling, rather than a tool meant to serve it. Instead of characters driving events through desire, failure, and hard choice, events increasingly exist to justify connections, to slot neatly into an ever-tightening timeline, turning the galaxy into a museum where everything is preserved and nothing is allowed to truly change. This obsession with maintenance drains stories of urgency, because the audience can sense that outcomes are constrained not by character limitation, but by franchise necessity, and tension evaporates when the story cannot risk breaking its own toys. Nothing is allowed to end, not definitively, not cleanly, and certainly not irrevocably, because death, sacrifice, and resolution are treated as temporary inconveniences rather than narrative endpoints, eroding the sense that actions carry permanent cost. When characters return from death, when sacrifices are undone, and when final moments are retroactively softened, the audience learns that grief is optional and consequences negotiable, undermining the emotional contract that myth relies on to function. In myth, limits matter, because loss is what gives choice weight, and without the possibility of irreversible failure, heroism becomes performative rather than transformative. The galaxy itself has stopped pushing back, no longer acting as a force that resists, challenges, or reshapes its inhabitants, but instead functioning as a static backdrop that absorbs conflict without visible scars. Characters survive, succeed, and move on with remarkable consistency. Yet the world around them remains largely unchanged politically, frozen and emotionally inert, as if events occur in isolation rather than rippling outward across civilizations. This absence of consequence flattens arcs, because transformation requires friction. And when the universe does not respond meaningfully to decisions, growth feels implied rather than earned. Scale, once one of Star Wars' greatest strengths, has become paradoxically confusing, not because the galaxy is too large, but because it is too familiar, looping endlessly through the same planets, factions, bloodlines, and conflicts. The universe is vast in theory, yet narratively claustrophobic, returning again and again to recognizable symbols, instead of allowing new ones to emerge, and claim significance through experience rather than association. Epic scale is not measured by size alone, but by the sense that the world extends beyond the frame, that unseen consequences are unfolding elsewhere, and that the story we are watching is only one thread in a larger tapestry. Modern Star Wars often gestures at this scale without committing to it, telling us the galaxy is changing while showing us the same dynamics rearranged with cosmetic variation. This creates a subtle but pervasive disconnect, where the audience is informed of importance rather than invited to feel it, because nothing seems to move forward irreversibly. Underlying all of this is a deeper problem: the erosion of narrative spine, the loss of a clear organizing principle that dictates what matters and why, leaving stories to float between tones, themes, and stakes without anchoring them to a cohesive moral framework. When myth loses its spine, it does not collapse immediately. It drifts, accumulating contradictions, hedging its statements, and avoiding conclusions that might alienate any segment of the audience. This drift is not accidental. It is the result of a system increasingly optimized for safety, for broad appeal, and for perpetual extension, rather than meaningful resolution. As this philosophy takes hold, the franchise begins to prioritize comfort over challenge, familiarity over growth, and continuity over consequence, setting the stage for a second, more damaging shift in how stories are allowed to function. Because once safety becomes the primary goal, meaning inevitably becomes optional, and myth, stripped of risk, begins to hollow out from the inside. Once safety becomes the guiding principle, risk is reframed as failure rather than necessity, and bold ideas are treated not as starting points for exploration, but as liabilities to be neutralized as quickly as possible, even when those ideas expose genuine thematic fault lines worth examining. Narrative experiments that provoke discomfort or division are softened, recontextualized, or quietly abandoned, signaling to the audience that conviction is negotiable, and that the story will retreat rather than wrestle with its own implications. This retreat teaches viewers not to invest fully, because emotional commitment is only rewarded when the story commits back. And modern Star Wars too often flinches at the moment where commitment would require irreversible change. Tone becomes one of the first casualties of this approach, as emotional gravity is repeatedly undercut by humour, meta-awareness, or spectacle designed to reassure rather than challenge, creating whiplash that dissolves immersion. Moments that should breathe are crowded with noise, jokes arrive before feelings can settle, and sincerity is treated as something that must be diluted lest it become uncomfortable. This tonal instability signals uncertainty, because myth relies on emotional coherence, and when a story cannot decide how seriously it takes itself, the audience learns to do the same. Heroes emerge from this environment strangely underdeveloped, not because they lack screen time, but because transformation is implied rather than dramatized, with growth arriving as a narrative assumption rather than a visible cost. Power, confidence, and authority are granted quickly, often justified through destiny, hidden lineage, or off-screen experience, bypassing the friction that once defined heroic ascent. Without struggle that leaves permanent marks, success feels frictionless, and characters plateau emotionally because nothing truly demands that they become someone new. Conflict itself begins to feel procedural, existing to fill runtime rather than to force change, with episodes resolving immediate threats while leaving the broader galaxy untouched and unmoved. Battles are fought, villains are repelled, and crises are averted, yet the political and emotional landscape resets almost immediately, creating a sense of narrative stasis that undermines urgency. When stories end without altering the conditions that produced them, continuation becomes obligation rather than anticipation, and the mythic engine stalls. At the heart of this stagnation is a misunderstanding of myth itself, because myth requires limits, boundaries that define what cannot be undone, and lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. When everything is possible, resurrection is routine, power has no ceiling, and the Force becomes a flexible utility rather than a moral force. Nothing retains symbolic weight. Specialness dissolves into convenience, and wonder is replaced by expectation because awe depends on scarcity and cost, not abundance without consequence. The Force once represented mystery, temptation, and discipline, a power that demanded restraint and exacted a price. But when it becomes endlessly malleable, it loses its capacity to teach anything beyond spectacle. Myth stops functioning when its rules exist only to be bypassed because meaning is generated through limitation, not through infinite exception. This erosion does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly, scene by scene, reversal by reversal, until the audience feels a diffuse sense that something essential has gone missing, even if they cannot immediately articulate what it is. What has been lost is not complexity or ambition, but commitment. The willingness to let ideas land hard, to let characters fail permanently, and to let the galaxy bear the scars of its own history. Without that willingness, Star Wars risks becoming an endless present tense, rich in imagery but poor in consequence, expansive in scope but shallow in impact. The franchise does not need to abandon its past to recover its spine, but it does need to remember that myth is not built on safety. It is built on sacrifice, boundaries, and the courage to let stories end. And until it relearns that endings are not threats but foundations, every new beginning will feel provisional, weightless, and quietly incomplete. The absence of finality creates a narrative environment where anticipation replaces resolution, and suspense becomes an endless tease rather than a path toward transformation, which slowly trains audiences to disengage emotionally. When viewers sense that no choice will be allowed to matter permanently, they recalibrate their expectations, watching for spectacle rather than meaning, and for surprise rather than significance. This shift does not happen because audiences are shallow, but because the stories have taught them that depth will not be honoured with consequence, making emotional restraint the safer response. Over time, this mutual hesitation erodes trust, and myth without trust cannot function, because belief is its primary currency. The result is a franchise that looks confident, but feels hollow, expansive yet strangely inert, always moving but rarely arriving anywhere that matters. There is still a path back to narrative cohesion, but it requires accepting that some questions must be answered definitively, some characters must be allowed to end, and some ideas must be followed even when they unsettle. It requires choosing meaning over maintenance, conviction over comfort, and consequence over convenience, even at the risk of division or temporary loss. Myth has never survived by pleasing everyone. It survives by telling the truth of its own values clearly enough that disagreement becomes engagement rather than apathy. Star Wars once understood this instinctively, trusting its audience to grapple with loss, ambiguity, and moral cost without softening the blow. Recovering that trust is not a matter of scale or budget, but of courage, the courage to let the galaxy change and to accept that some doors, once closed, should stay that way. A story with limits invites belief, and belief is what once allowed this galaxy to feel infinite despite its rules. Without limits, infinity collapses into noise, and without consequence, myth collapses into content.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.